So, gjâ-zym-byn is a personal language, more of an art lang than an English lang. It doesn't aim for naturalism or plausibility in a fictional context. I started working on it in 1998, and within a couple of years,
Try that.
okay. I started working on it in early 1998, but within a couple of years, it was well developed enough for me to start using it for the main purpose I created for, writing a diary. Then over the next few years, as I used it more and became more fluent in it, I was able to write longer and longer diary entries in gjâ-zym-byn and fewer in English. I use gjâ-zym-byn almost every day now, thinking and writing in it even on days when I don't write anything in it. Today I'm going to talk about a few of the changes the language has gone through over time, which fall into three categories for the most part. Mistakes I made in early design and which I need to correct as I realized those mistakes in the course of actually using the language. Deliberate changes to make the language more concise or expressive. And unconscious organic changes emerging out of usage. I'm going to mainly talk about the first and third type of change because they seem to be more interesting overall. gjâ-zym-byn is a postpositional language. It uses particles following their heads instead of preceding them as if it would like English prepositions. In 1998, when I started designing it, I had not seriously studied any postpositional language. My total exposure to postpositions was just a handful of sample sentences in John Lyon's Introduction to Theoretical Linguistics. So I knew that postpositions followed their heads, but I didn't know how postpositional phrases typically fit into sentences in postpositional languages. Early on, I had postpositional phrases following their heads as in prepositional languages like English. Here in example 1, I felt alone behind the desk with my fingers. Here, part of the hand, modifies as yam, a finger or toe, or some similar things. And it follows the postpositional phrase that yam is part of, yam no, using the finger or toe or whatever. And I even sometimes had postpositional phrases embedded within the postpositional phrases. For instance, moi tu I zim gjâ I kui gjâ-zym. But I hide my thoughts and dreams. Here, I is embedded within zim gjâ kui. And then Kisaki Patrickram Nimpi O Rumzi. I went to St. Patrick's Church. Patrickram Nimpi, named for Patrick, is embedded within Kisaki O to the church. So I found with experience of writing and reading what I've written that this ordering was confusing. It felt more natural to order them with the postpositional phrases preceding what they modified. So for instance, moi or zum gjâ miti gjâ-zym, but I had my thoughts and dreams. For example 4 on the page. gjâ-zym-byn's original number system was based on prime numbers. It had no number base per se, but had root words for 0, 1, all the primes up to 113, and a few interesting larger primes, and other mathematical constants like pi. And expressed all rational numbers as a product, sum, difference, or quotient of those roots. After a while, I had to admit, and I had originally suspected, that the system was fun but not very practical. So I added root words for 10, 16, and some powers of each. And I now tend to express most composite numbers for about 30 on that, using one or more of the base 10 roots. However, I still express prime numbers up to about 37 with root words. And I use prime numbers along with the base 10 roots for expressing middling size composite numbers. Anything that can be expressed as a factor of 2 or 3 of the small primes, I tend to express that way. Early on, gjâ-zym-byn had an unusual word order for comparison, not inherently, but relative to the overall structure of the language. Languages with verb-object order, like English, typically have quality marker standard order. For instance, bigger than an elephant. So you've got quality bigger, the marker than, and the standard, you're comparing it to the elephant. Languages with object-verb order, like gjâ-zym-byn, typically have standard marker quality order, as though we said elephant and bigger. gjâ-zym-byn used to arrange comparative expressions with a quality marker standard order. Its marker was a comparative conjunction thing, similar to the English as or than. For instance, Heracles ran mi'i pichu bisra de Achilles ran mini. Hercules is stronger than Achilles. I had trouble mastering this, not because it's in itself unfamiliar, but because it's essentially similar to that in English, but probably because it's out of sync with the overall structure of the language. I eventually changed it so comparison uses a compared to postposition, diffui, compared to a root, derived from a root meaning to compare, which in turn is derived from the name of the Unix command diff. So, example 6.
Oh my God.
Achilles ram diffui, pichu thrabi, mini, Heracles ram mi'i. Hercules is stronger than Achilles. gjâ-zym-byn was designed to mark theta roles with many highly specific postpositions. Theta roles are the general semantic meaning of a grammatical case like subject or object, or the genitive or possessor, for instance. There are, underlying those, there are more specific semantic roles like the agent and patient and experiencer that John talked about. Or roles of the genitive, there's the person who owns something, the person who has something in their possession. I own that bag even though it's not with me right at the moment. I own a car that's some hundreds of miles away, etc. So gjâ-zym-byn distinguishes these into very specific data roles, marked by very specific case postpositions, rather than bundling them into a few core cases like nominative, accusative, or ergative absolutive languages. But the exact way it does this has changed a lot over time as I develop new case postpositions, and they take over some of the work previously borne by more general postpositions. One notable case involves what I call a topic postposition, mi'i. Originally, mi'i corresponded roughly with what I understood to be the topic role in a topic prominent language. Understood to be, I didn't understand it that well at the time. In contrast to comment. It also corresponded to the preposition about in English sentences such as Roger owns many books about innovation, or Don knows a lot about the history of economy. From there it was extended to be the focus argument for verbs of thinking, knowing, and sensing. And it also marked the non-agentive core argument of many stated verbs. With all this polysomy, I soon realized that I had some conflict. Types of sentence where more than one argument would be marked by mi'i. So I tried a temporary stopgap of a meta topic, mi'i, to mark the less agent-like argument. Here, example 7, Saban gjâ-zym-byn said mi'i. I approve of and am thankful for this. Here, the mi'i argument, which forced the focus to be marked by mi'i, is actually implicit. It's the default first-person subject. gjâ-zym-byn uses a lot of defaults to make things more concise. It used to be all clauses default to first person if there wasn't an explicit experience or agent. Now it defaults to the subject of the previous clause. I finally decided that mi'i was too polysemous, and I needed to reassign some of its functions to other postpositions. First, I generalized the root cat, which formerly meant looking at, to mean attention more generally, and from it derived the postposition cat-y, to mark the object of attention for sensory verbs. And then, influenced by John Quixote's equal, I added the root word the experiencer, and derived from the postposition gjâ-zym-byn to mark the experiencer for taking the effective verbs he was talking about. The nurse saw a cat with no tail. Then the postposition gjâ-zym-byn, derived from the root meaning quest, now marks the object of verbs of desire or communication verbs such as to request. Vakar rengsra gjâ-zym-byn suruvan Oliver gjâ-zym-byn. Oliver wanted more food. Vakar rengsra gjâ-zym-byn lazi Oliver to eat. Oliver asked for more food. Mitti continues to mark the object or focus of some other mental and communication verbs. And the thing one is thinking or talking about is not present to the senses, like the object of cat eat. To eat. We discussed plans for our upcoming trip. And it also marks the non-agentive subject of stative verbs, where the subject is not an animate experiencer. Yalman puri mitti. It's hot. Then more recently, trul-i, derived from a root meaning performance or recital, took over the job of marking transitory event focus, an object that comes into existence while the action of verb is going on. For instance, example 13, Jinghan yishu mitti, shuntwa trul-i, multla tu-i. The policeman sang Christmas carols. The suffix "-byn", there in the second word of example 14, was originally designed for deriving of initiality adverbs from stems denoting sources of evidence. So, for instance, Blevan Putin Wemby. Blevan Putin Wemby. It's raining. I know because I hear raindrops on the roof. Femqua mitti Putin Yelid mitti. I read somewhere the garlic is good for you.
Yeah.
However, over time I found myself using the same suffix with stems denoting emotions and other mental states to indicate my attitude toward the situation described by the sentence. For instance, Trapo Garchan Wadlin Yergi Yuthazi Yongbin. I wrote 1,000 words, and I'm satisfied with this work. Yong is an emotion word signifying being satisfied with one's creative work, or work more generally, but especially creative work. When I realized I'd started using the suffix in this divergent sense, I considered creating a separate suffix for this other use. However, I decided that using the same suffix for these two different senses wouldn't create any ambiguity, because an emotion is not evidence for a proposition. So they would be using usually disjoint sets of stems. Originally, my writing system for gjâ-zym-byn consisted of 24 letters of the Roman alphabet, with hashtags and circumflexes over many of those letters. See if I can get a mouse pointer on that screen. Here we go. So over the first couple of years, I experimented with ways of writing those letters, mainly but not exclusively the ones with diacritics. And I generally ended up merging the diacritic into the main letter form in some way. Then over time, my increasingly fluent use of the language led to me writing faster, which led to further changes in some of those letters. Then, in 2006, I started doing a corpus analysis, looking for the most frequent sequences of letters, the most frequent words and morphemes, for the most part, and started substituting new glyphs for some of the most common stems, postpositions, conjunctions, and suffixes. Most recently, I think in 2010, I started writing the incorporated pronouns as a kind of diacritic over the verb suffix. So I'll show here a sequence of images showing the development of the writing system from the mid-1998 to the present. I no longer have some of the very earliest papers from about March of 1998. So here, in a page from mid-1998, you can see the distinct letters with the diacritics written at completely distinct marks over them. There's the incircumflex for nga, the velar-nasal, and I # for I, then various pronouns written with #x. Here's a vocabulary study sheet from mid-1998. You can see here at the top the colored words written in magic marker and ink of different kinds, and distinct diacritics over some of the letters. Here, late 98 or early 99, you can see some of the diacritics that they've got version of the letter. They're twa, that A circumflexes merged together. But down here, use to read, the verb suffix has this distinct circumflex over the O still. And look how sharp and pointy that circumflex still is over that. Here's a page of experimentation from early 99 where I was experimenting with different ways of writing these letters. And here in June 1999, there's a lot of the letters have obtained produced the final form they have today. There's a new sentence I was pointing to vid, and that little thing that looks like a 6 was the O circumflex in the original orthography. Over here, the C circumflex still looks pretty much like one, except it's merged into one form. There's the thin circumflex, and this was a G circumflex. This was E #. Could you? Here's a page from about a year later. You can see some examples of more letters. Down at the bottom of the page, I'm calling a word for cut or cut, and drawing some examples of things to cut with. Cut, shots, rock, off. There are several cutting tools. Here from 2004, you can see at the top of the page. Let's see if I can zoom in on that. I was trying for a while to write proper names with a preceding apostrophe, rather than capital letters as in English and many other European languages. Whether Peak, the language Whether Peak, there, I was studying at the time, and Wikipedia found a few lines later. Down here at the bottom of the page, in the left margin, there's the innovation mark, this plus arrow sign. It's used this to mark newly coined words that I need to enter into the lexicon whenever I do that note later. Here's a historic page from early 2005 where I stopped using hyphens in between morphemes. At the top of the page, you can see I'm still using the hyphens, and then here I decided to just quit using them. There at the top of the page, I'm using accent marks to mark the accent and the syllabic consonants in foreign proper names. Michael, there with acute accent on the A and grave on the L. Further down, here's the uncertainty mark in the left margin, the question mark with an arrow through it, to mark a newly coined word that I'm not too sure about. I may mark this as a nonce word that only occurs once, and I've come up with a more satisfying word for that concept to be used permanently. Here from March 2007, you can see I've begun to use new glyphs for the verb suffixes, the active verb suffix. Z, there's the Z curly Q, there's the ampersand for word of the conjunction being and, and this B curly Q is the stated verb suffix von. Here, In 2010, there are several new additional glyphs, but here there's the incorporated pronoun written as a diacritic over the z, z, with the pronoun, the third person pronoun written as a diacritic, a little circle over the z. And then a couple of lines later, track z with the first person pronoun written as a diacritic, kind of like a macron. The curly brackets are quotation marks. I started using curly brackets rather than straight quotes a lot earlier than this, but this happens to be the first good example that was combined on the page with examples of other neat things. Here is a glyph designed by the writer who's sitting in the back row there. He designed it in ninth grade biology class, putting it together from some earlier glyphs he had designed, and later started using it as part of a signature. And a few years ago, I started using it as a glyph to represent his name. Here, in 2011, by this point, I've started using several more new glyphs. Here, will, sleep, vishar, conjunction meaning then or a little while later. Rumzi, the most common verb in the corpus, to come or go or move. And empo, compound sim meaning respiratory treatment. Looks a little bit like a pair of lungs. You can see that will and empo look a little bit similar. In fact, I find them too similar, and I've decided to change one of them, probably will, to look a little different, more distinct. But I haven't come up with a final new form yet. Here, the next line, there's zip-in, not an orthographical feature per se, but I just wanted to point out another example of the pin evidentiality, validationality suffix. Z means a dream, so this adverb zip-in at the beginning of the sentence means this stuff happened in a dream. There's an M with a curly Q, me, and another example of the incorporated pronoun diacritics. And then K, this K with a little curly Q to the left. Here's the gjâ-zym-byn Christmas card from 2012, a translation from St. Luke's Gospel, and suddenly there appeared with the angel multitude of the heavenly host. You can see I can write a lot neater when I'm not in a hurry. And then in a page from February this year, no special new features to note, but just you can see how sloppy I can get when I'm writing more fluently, rapidly about topics where I don't have to stop to think about how to express them, things I've talked about a lot before. Are there any questions then? Yes? Get you the microphone.
Yeah, sorry. Where's the question? There.
So how do you find ways to practice your language? Do you journal in it? Do you translate things on purpose? Do you do exercises? How do you practice your language?
So I write my diary in it, as I said. Most of the pages I showed there, except for a few early pages from 98 to 99, were diary entries. I don't necessarily write in it every day, but I try to write in it pretty frequently. And then I go back and reread earlier diary entries to build up fluency. So I'll have a stack of notebooks, like a shelf full of notebooks. Right now I'm writing the current notebook, and I'm also going back and rereading a notebook from about a year ago, noting all the new words that aren't in the lexicon, those things with an uncertainty mark, an innovation mark next to them, and make notes of them and then going back and entering them into the lexicon, and also doing an index of that volume. I do some translations from time to time. I haven't done a lot of it recently except for translation relay games, but I have translated some longish texts into the language before. And I've done some original writing besides the diary. a couple of short stories, most of them not finished yet. I participated in Local Write-Mo, our local common lang writing month, a couple of times. And I've also written some other things that were part of that.
So for the writing system, it's like I assume you can handwrite a lot of stuff, and so the diacritics and the merging of glyphs and whatever tends to be pretty useful. It feels almost like you're moving in the direction of like medieval manuscripts, where people write so much stuff that they just have to combine things. Do you feel like it's more for just ease of writing?
Yeah, it's mainly for ease of writing. The example sentences that I showed earlier use the Unicode writing system, which is still pretty much phonemic, one character per phoneme, except for the nasal sign that nasalizes the preceding vowel. And it still uses the hyphens in between morphemes. The writing system started out like that with one character per phoneme and the hyphens between glyphs to make it easier to write and read for a beginner who's not fluent in the language yet. As I got more fluent in it, I dropped the hyphens and then started looking for other ways to make it more concise. So there are other changes I didn't talk about so much about ways to make the language itself more concise. What I'm showing here is mainly ways to make the writing system more concise by replacing the most frequent sequences with new glyphs.
So my question is really specific from one of the glosses from that first page, and it was under example number 11. So you have gloss there 1, 3. How are you using those numbers there? Is that to discuss?
In the glosses,
Yeah.
1 and 3 refer to first and third person.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Later on here, when I use actual numbers, I write them out as numbers, and when I'm using first and second and third person, I write the digits. That's, if I understand that correctly, that's the standard for the Leipzig glossary rules.
I think I was reading too much into the primal system, with 1, 3 being prime numbers representing some really abstract concept that I needed to know about.
Here, the 1 and 3 are just first and third person.
So you seem to be capturing a lot of richness of thought or context that we often lack in English. So if someone asks you to translate something from English, like, it's beautiful out today, isn't it? Do you feel like you need to add more context? Do you just do a straightforward translation, or do you need to look out the window and decide, for example?
Well, I would probably say from where from is a root meaning the emotion of appreciating beauty, of aesthetic pleasure, and implies a positive. Nin is the comment of position, and then the topic, which is in the modern language not explicitly marked in informal use, but at the end of the sentence it's not explicitly marked. So the midi is implicit there. It could be more formally from midi, puri midi, and puri is a word meaning environment. If I wanted to be more specific about the part of the environment that I can see directly, not counting the stuff behind me, it would be puri tau, which would be environment, sensation, or perception.
Is this on? Yes. I'm curious. Suppose you had gjâ-zym-byn to do over again, knowing what you know now. Do you have any idea of like just a couple things that you would do differently from the start?
I would do a lot of things differently. Specifically,
like,
for instance,
what's the top ones?
One thing that comes to mind at the moment is the morphophonology, the different vowels marking different root classes. I think that leads to a somewhat monotonous sound to a language, and it's also a little frustrating when trying to coin new words, especially when I'm trying to borrow a word from Latin, a taxonomic name of an animal. Trying to borrow it, it goes through a lot of mutation, like when Schleier's borrowing words into Bumpuke. and has all these morphological restrictions on the forms of words and the phonemes you can use. So I would have made this that much restricted. It made the language easier to learn, but it doesn't necessarily make it easier to use for day-to-day, and it gives the language a more monotonous sound than I would like. I would probably also have found a way to derive new postpositions from root words that doesn't make them so verbose. All of the abstract non-spatial postpositions are at least 2 syllables, and many of them are 3 syllables. And that makes the language less concise than it could be. I partly work around that by adding new rules about not explicitly marking the theta role of the subject, the agent or experience or topic if it's at the end of the sentence, the default position.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm very impressed by your language and how different it is from your native language, which I assume is English. And what impressed me was the word order. You have object, verb, subject. And
Yes.
First of all, how is it that you came up with that? And then how is it that you think in that? Because I have object, subject, verb, and I find that foreign to my thinking.
So object, verb, subject is the default order. It can vary a lot in practice. For instance, in subordinate relative clauses, whatever is relative adjective tends to be fronted with that's the agent or the patient or the form. And there are also a lot of the topic comment sentences where the topic is fronted before the comment. But how I came up with the order, I'm not sure. An early version of the language was verb, subject, object. And then I kind of kept the verb, subject clustered close together and allowed the object to move around. But given the way that each of the theta roles is marked so specifically, the ordering the phrases in the verb, the noun phrases in the verb, can vary a lot from one sentence to the next.
That's interesting.
And how I learned it, I guess, just practice.
So it feels natural to you then to start out with the object. Okay. Do you feel that gives it emphasis, or
What's that?
do you feel that starting it out gives it emphasis, the object emphasis? This is something I've wondered about.
Maybe so. When we front an object in English, we're giving it emphasis, but we're putting it out of its normal place.
That book, I hate it. Yeah.
When I move the subject to a different position outside of the, if I move the object to a different position from its default in gjâ-zym, that would be emphasizing it in different ways. Or more commonly, I might emphasize it by adding a particle afterward, like a behold particle. Behold this book I read, kind of thing.
Oh, cool. Will you allow one more question?
Sure.
Okay. And that is, somebody asked you to translate, it is beautiful outside, isn't it? What interests me are these question tags at the end, which can be very cryptotypic. And you didn't include one, but do you have question tags like n'est-ce pas?
Yes, I do. I don't use them very often, and there are some features of the language that aren't used often that I'm not really good with. I refer you to my grammar page. That particular kind of isn't a question tag. It's not something I use very often.
Because it's sort of emphatic too. It makes
Right.
it, yeah, emphatic.
Keep in mind the main way I use the language is for writing a diary.
Uh-huh.
Writing dialogue in fiction or translated original fiction is something I don't do all the time, and I have to sometimes think about how to do it.
Right, I didn't expect you to translate, isn't it? But, all right, somebody else.
Well, thanks very much, Jim.